Okay, so the event is called What is Public Philosophy? So I guess getting straight to the point, and maybe we'll do this in alphabetical order. So starting with Peter and then Evelyn and then Lucia. What is public philosophy? What do you think it is? And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your own work in public philosophy. So Peter.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with these other two panelists, and thanks to everyone for joining us. So I was thinking about this question and decided that this is a very difficult question, in that the question, what is public philosophy, seems to imply that we would know what philosophy is, and then we sort of say what the public part of it is. And so I'm going to be cowardly and just assume that either we all know what philosophy is, or that we're not ever going to know what philosophy is, and we're certainly not going to sort it out tonight. So I'm going to focus on the public part. And even then I'm going to be cowardly again and start with the easier part of your question, which is just talk about what I've done and then sort of segue into the answering the actual question. So just briefly, I've been running a podcast since 2010, which covers the history of philosophy. I started with pre-Socratic philosophy, and I'm now up to the Reformation. And I've also covered some like non-Western or maybe global traditions in philosophy, including Islamic philosophy, classical Indian philosophy, Africana philosophy, and next year we're moving on to Chinese philosophy. So that's kind of why I'm here, I guess, today. And I think maybe my take on the question is very influenced by that project, because I don't really think that there's like public philosophy and maybe you could call it specialist philosophy, and that these are neatly bifurcated options that divide philosophy in half or something. I see it much more as a continuum. So to my mind, what I'm doing is actually kind of presenting specialized philosophy to the public, i.e. to a much larger audience than usually gets to know about specialized philosophy. And obviously there are various things I have to do to make that possible, like making it more accessible, maybe using funnier examples than you would use in a philosophy journal article or something. But I think people often associate public philosophy with something like dumbing down or oversimplifying. And not only am I trying not to do that, but actually for example, when I'm teaching at the university, I often tell people, okay, look, we're going to cover ancient philosophy in one semester, which means that I'm going to have to skip a lot. If you want the whole story, go listen to my podcast. So in that case, I actually tell people at the university who are in theory, like in the process of becoming something like specialists, I tell them that if they want the full nuanced version, they should go look at my public project. So I think what that means is that when people sort of say, well, public philosophy is good, technical philosophy or specialist philosophy is a waste of time, or vice versa, they're not taking account of the fact that there's like there's a kind of give and take between the two. And I think this is true for other philosophy podcasts, actually. So things like Philosophy Bites, for example, where they have on an expert and the expert tells about their own research, but in a way that people can kind of follow and understand in 15 or 20 minutes. So I think of it as a kind of symbiotic thing where public philosophy is what we always think philosophy is, but for a broader audience. And I may have a more or less intimate relationship to expert philosophy.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, I certainly also, for what it's worth, send my students in the direction of several different philosophy podcasts, because I do think there's, it can fill in the gaps, right? That a compressed course can't necessarily cover. Same question to you, Evelyn. What do you think public philosophy is? So again, the same nice easy question. And maybe a little bit about what public philosophy is to you and what kind of thing you're doing.
Yeah, I agree with Peter Adamson that, pardon me, that I think there's a really fundamental human impulse to philosophize, to think abstractly. And so, everyone does that. But we have a certain tradition in the university of doing it in a particular way with its specific norms and practices and a canon. And the phrase public humanities comes out of experiences in the 70s and 80s and 90s of academics realizing that there wasn't a lot of uptake for what we have to offer to society. And so the more explicit attempt to bring what we've been doing in universities to communities other than just teaching 20-year-olds, right? And so public philosophy encompasses really all of the ways of doing that. And I was in the leadership of the Public Philosophy Network, a professional organization mostly for academic philosophers or people with academic training. And we just make an explicit attempt to cover all kinds of ways that people who have been trained in the academy or work in universities then have some explicit attempt to connect with people who are not university connected. And so that can be, I think Lucia will say more about this, like through prisons or teaching children. In the US, we have hardly any philosophy taught in schools. And so there are a lot of people who are connecting with their local schools to do that. But it can also mean connecting with professionals in all walks of life. And I know we're going to talk about that more later, that's kind of my own emphasis, and through the media. And so it's not just, it includes philosophers who have academic research programs that, connect with bioethics or political philosophy, publicizing what they've been working on in ways that general audiences will find compelling. But it's also so many other different ways that people have of building a connection between their academic work and other parts of society.
Yeah, so I mean, you kind of hinted at it there, but I think maybe just because it will probably come up, maybe you could say something about field philosophy, because
right,
yes. Kind of, I mean, maybe it's like a subcategory of public philosophy.
I think it is a subcategory. I think it has to do with the ways that philosophers who are academic philosophers or who have been trained in academic philosophy but have other careers outside of the academy connect with practitioners or professionals. So there's a edited collection. It has very little of my writing in it. There's so many wonderful philosophers who wrote narrative stories about how they came to work with practitioners and professionals in other fields. So there's stories. There's a story that John Broome tells about being one of only 2 philosophers on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there are people who have worked with business, people who have worked, there's an author who works with addicts and talks about psychology of addiction and working with both professionals and in the court system. So there's just a lot of different ways that, bioethicists, I think, do this all the time. They take it for granted that their role is to work on bioethical questions and work with hospitals, with the medical professionals. But a lot of us, those of us who work in political theory or philosophy of science, might not think explicitly about our career connecting with people who are working in those other professional fields. And so it's a program to build those connections and to work collaboratively with people who aren't philosophers.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, sort of within the academy, there's like a maybe strategic reason to want to do this at the moment because of the kind of emphasis on interdisciplinarity. And I think sometimes philosophers can feel like interdisciplinary work is difficult for a philosopher, but I think if you're a field philosopher, that's kind of what you're doing, right?
And it's not just philosophers, it's social scientists too, but mostly in the humanities. So humanities, the students who want to study humanities fields, that has been shrinking. And at the same time, it's professional fields that are getting undergraduate students and then training professionals. But sometimes those areas don't have the solid background in philosophy that we can provide. And so it just expands the ways in which we can make our work have an impact, whether it's on science or technology or government or education or all of those different areas.
And yeah, and I suppose in the UK, the word impact is another thing that's like, there's a strategic reason to do that. Lucia, same question to you. Yeah, what is public philosophy? What's your kind of public philosophy? Yeah, what kind of work are you doing?
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. I'll try to to suggest a definition, I will say in one sentence that we could see public philosophy as an invitation to think, and particularly to think philosophically. I follow Peter's suggestion to be coward here. So let's assume we all agree about what does it mean to think philosophically. But I like to see public philosophy as this kind of operation, enterprise. You want to invite other people to do the same activity as you do. And by other people, I mean basically everyone willing to accept this invitation. So starting from children to elderly to business people, retired people or prisoners. Why I've come to this kind of definition? On one side, because it's wide enough to include all great variety of experiences and initiatives that today we have in public philosophy. If we take, for example, the companion of public philosophy that just came out, and both Peter and Evelyn contributed to it, we see 42 papers with very different experiences. We got public philosophy through TV show, through YouTube, through also live event like walking through nature groups, or philosophy for children, for prison. So the difficulty for in other kind of definition is how can you define a so huge movement looking for one methodology or one way to do it? That would not be possible. Whereas I believe that the goal of the practice is something all these experiences have in common. And the goal is a didactic one, a myotical one, if you like. So the goal is to help other people who otherwise would not have access to philosophy, as Evelyn said. In USA, philosophy is not taught in the high school. In Italy, yes, but only in a few high schools. So it's something really elitary. Whereas public philosopher wants to bring access to everyone. Also, I believe this kind of definition allows us to include, but also to discriminate public philosophy from other philosophical practices. I'm thinking to discriminate, to distinguish public philosophy from dissemination or from academic philosophy, in the sense not that they are different professions, different fields of our profession. They are all part of the same notion of philosophy, but their goal is different. I see research or academic philosophy has mainly an epistemic goal. When I'm doing academic philosophy, I want to, or I'm trying to elaborate a better understanding of an issue. Truth, justice, or consciousness, no? And ultimately a better understanding of our reality. While I'm doing public philosophy with children or prisoners, obviously I don't have that goal in mind. I'm not pretending to come out with a brand new definition of justice, happiness, or whatever. What I want to try to do is to help them to understand their notion of truth, of justice, of happiness. So I believe the two goals are a bit different. One is epistemic, the other is more pedagogical or didactic. And I like very much what Jack Russell Weinstein wrote. He says something like that. Academic philosophy has the goal to move forward the discipline, whereas public philosophy has the goal to move forward the individual. And I find myself in agreement with this definition. So while I'm engaging in public philosophy to children or elderly, I'm always trying to do the same. No matter which is the starting point of the discussion, my goal in that moment is to bring the discussion a bit higher, to help them to understand what is going on when they are talking about any topic, and to show them how philosophical thinking works.
That's brilliant, thank you. So you mentioned, and we've mentioned a couple of times, that the kind of work that you're doing is with different demographics of people, right? And I guess obviously you can't generalize too much and say like children do philosophy this way and elderly people do. But do you find that there's anything kind of do different demographics bring something different to the table, or do you find that there's a different kind of experience with children from what there is with older people, for example?
Well, yes, I've noticed by doing it that well, children are easygoing if you want to, because with adults, the problem is that we as adults have a lot of bias, a lot of prejudice and stereotypes, which are very difficult to eradicate it. Whereas children are more open to disagreement. With adults, the challenge is not to make them feel judged. So you always have to specify, is your idea or your thesis that we are criticizing and we are, putting under exam is not your person. So perhaps this is one difference between a very young audience and adult audience. With elderly people, I've noticed that their personal experience, their history life is very heavy. It has a sort of epistemic weight, if you allow me to say so, because they tend to see every concept, every topic through the lens of their personal experience. So there, our job is try to translate their personal, very specific experience into something more general or through universal concept, or trying to re-elaborate these stories, very interesting stories, but in more general terms, in a theory that everybody can understand, even with different story lives. So perhaps I will stop here and say that could be a difference between the age of different groups.
Thank you. Before I move on to my kind of second question for everybody, maybe I could just circle back to Peter and particularly the podcast, so History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And again, as I said, I'm primarily a historian of philosophy, so I'm kind of interested in, and it's great that it's so popular, right? So I guess what's my question? What is it that history of philosophy can do for the public? So kind of connecting it up with what Evelyn does which is field philosophy. Can a historian of philosophy be a field philosopher, or what is it that the history of philosophy specifically is doing for a public audience?
Yeah, something I always think about this is that if you ask kind of like non-academics, so something we've been talking a lot, or maybe assuming here, is that there's kind of non-public philosophy and public philosophy, and it's the same thing as the difference between academic philosophy, like philosophy at universities, and outside of universities, which might actually not be true. Like there could be an expert philosopher who's not an academic, right? And in fact, there are, so for example, Nigel Warburton, who runs Philosophy Bites, as I mentioned, kind of left academic philosophy in order to run a philosophy podcast, right? So actually this has also been mentioned by some people in the chat, that this kind of academic versus non-academic thing is a little bit tricky, but maybe for the sake of argument, let's say that public philosophy usually involves academics who are reaching out to beyond the academy. I think that's usually true. So going back to your question, I think that people outside the academy usually think that history, when you ask them like what comes to your mind when you think of philosophy, they might come up with like a problem, like an ethical problem, but probably the first thing they'll say is, well, like Plato and Descartes, right? So in other words, they think of history of philosophy as the main thing that is philosophy, which is a real mismatch with what academic philosophers think, right? I mean, in academia, you have to persuade other philosophers to take history of philosophy seriously, the non-historians. So what I think that I'm doing is, in a way, I'm kind of talking to an audience that's already predisposed to think of philosophy as a historical phenomenon, and probably they know some kind of high points, so to speak. And what I'm trying to, and that hence the name of the podcast, right? So it's called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, because the idea is, I'm sort of assuming you've at least heard of Plato and Aristotle and Descartes, and I'm trying to use the approach that you would actually use in a history podcast, but about philosophy, in order to show that there's this like long continuous story. I think of it really as like telling a story, or kind of narrative that goes over many episodes. And so in a lot of ways, it has the aims of a history podcast as much as it does the aims of a philosophy podcast. And so there's a lot of things that a public audience could get out of that, but these are things that an academic audience could get out of it just as much, and maybe even need to get this out of it even more. So for example, if you do it this way, it's perfectly natural to cover philosophy in all different times and places, right? Like India, China, Africa, Latin America, wherever, right? Because you're just trying to cover all of it. And so that's how my project kind of, without me intending to, became this big global philosophy project. And in some ways, I have found that that's an easier thing for a public audience to get on board with than an academic audience, because the academic audience is like, wait a minute, are you telling me I have to teach courses on Confucianism? Right. Whereas a non-specialist audience was like, oh, okay, Confucianism, cool. Right. So that's just one example, but I think there's a lot of ways that people are just very interested in the history of philosophy, and they want to know how it connects to all kinds of other things. Like, for example, the next thing I have to write scripts about for my podcast is Shakespeare. And I would never teach a class on philosophy and Shakespeare because I'm just not qualified, but it's like a very easy thing to be interested in. Oh, philosophical aspects of Shakespeare, right? So I personally can't wait to find out what I'm supposed to say about it, but I don't know yet.
I mean, yeah, that's a really interesting point that and I think you're probably right that to people kind of, again, so we'll come on to this academic, non-academic philosophy distinction, but to many people, you're right, maybe philosophy is the history of philosophy, but actually within the discipline, so for example, there's this paper that came out recently called The End of History, where a philosopher has argued that we don't really need the history of philosophy, which obviously amongst historians of philosophy has got people talking. But so that's an interesting discrepancy maybe between the public perception of philosophy and its history and the perception within the discipline. I mean, maybe because it's coming up a lot in the chat and was kind of suggested by what you were saying there, Peter, maybe we can kind of jump to, I had a question about kind of power dynamics. So maybe this is getting to what people are talking about in the chat, for example. So, I mean, one reason that I asked this question is there was a blog post by Timothy Williamson, who's a philosopher in Oxford, who cautioned against what he called populist philosophy. So he kind of thinks like, we shouldn't kind of, I mean, this is my take on it. We should be careful to ensure that the right kind of people are seen as experts in philosophy in the same way that the right kind of people are experts in the sciences, for example, right? So you need to be an expert physicist in order to write a text on popular physics or something like that. So, I mean, what's my question? Kind of, what are the power dynamics in public philosophy, or maybe like, what should they be? I mean, and I guess relatedly, who is public philosophy for, right? Is it, and how democratic should it be? If those questions make sense. I mean, if anyone, I mean, feel free anyone to jump in there. If anyone has any thoughts. Evelyn, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on the Timothy Williams thing specifically, but I've been reading the chat some, and I think in my own answer and some of the other things we've been saying, we've kind of been focusing on the direction of flow from experts to publics. But one of the things that field philosophy and many of the other areas of philosophy too think about is that as experts, we tend to sometimes get into a track, right? And we're trained and we inherit a conceptual framework, and then we use it and we apply it. And then sometimes we lose track of the context, and we can even build ourselves into a rut that's quite different from what's going on in society. And so I think one of the benefits of field philosophy and of the other ways that people practice public philosophy is that we are in a position to listen to how other people are framing problems and what they have to offer, that we can then bring back into the profession and open up some of the conceptions that we have that we've maybe been taking for granted because the problems that we were trained into 30 years ago are different than the problems that society is having right now. I'm a philosopher of science, and so I think when I was trained in the 1990s, I inherited a framework that was formulated in the 60s and 70s that said that science is value-free and should be value-free. But since the 90s, philosophers of science have really been pointing out the many ways that science is not value-free, that values influence all kinds of judgments throughout the scientific process. And we get a lot of that from working with scientists and from working with people who are impacted by science, right? By sometimes activists, for instance, who can point out in studies that there are assumptions that are made that are not really close to our experience. And I will say right now, when I work in environmental philosophy, working on conservation, one of the topics that's coming up all the time is that Western philosophy doesn't have, like, that we have a conception of society as separate from nature, and that something is natural really to the, especially in the US and our concept of wilderness, that something is natural to really to the extent that it's separate from society. And so I think a lot of people are trying to listen to indigenous conceptions of relationships and understanding kinship in nature. And this is like an ongoing thing. There's not a framework for incorporating that into Western philosophy right now, but it's where I think that by listening, we're in the process of opening up the way that philosophers think about these problems.
Brilliant. Lucia, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Well, yes, I could have many things today to say. I start with your question about populist and public philosophy. I've read that article of Williamson, but I believe him, while he's suggesting this distinction, populist and public philosophy, has something in mind which is different from the public philosophy I have in mind. And he says something like populist philosophy believes that everyone is entitled to be as qualified as the professionals. And obviously I don't believe that. Is exactly because we believe that philosophy is difficult, requires education, it requires training, it requires practices that I believe we want to propose provocation to other people. We want to provide other people with provocation to do philosophy. Is exactly we acknowledge that philosophy is difficult, that we are trying to make the society aware of how good it is to at least have the experience of philosophical thinking, at least try this kind of education. I like to see philosophy, and this is a metaphilosophical assumption, as, the one unique thing. One easy way to say that is by recalling the Plato myth of cave, where you have, the philosopher who works out through the cave in order to gain true knowledge and to gain the understanding of reality. But then the myth continues and the philosopher walks back in order to call the other citizen, to follow him or her to the same path. And this myth could describe perhaps the relationship between academic philosopher and public philosopher. Academic philosopher is the first way out the cave and the searching for always a better and better understanding of reality. Public philosopher goes back with all the risk they are, for Plato, it got killed, but I mean, it's the attempt to bring other people to do the same. So I believe that this myth acknowledge that to do philosophy requires an education, requires a training, is not something that everyone can immediately perform. That's what was also Hegel worried when he said not everyone can immediately do philosophy. He defended the professionalism of philosophy, but then he suggested a way for everyone to do philosophy through history of philosophy, by the way. So was also history of philosophy was seen as an exercise, to do philosophy. And I also agree with what Evelyn said, that by going back to citizen, it also happens. So it's not only a paternalistic way to present the professional and the public, but it also happened that the professional learn a lot. And I believe I've experienced that you learned epistemic humility. I mean, people help you to tackle your epistemic injustice that we all have as discipline. No, when you work with prisoners or with children or with trial people, they provide you with different perspectives, and this is really a useful way to neutralize, or to attempt to neutralize, the epistemic injustice that otherwise will dominate our academic narratives. So maybe the two directions are valid.
And I think that's a really, really nice point. And it's a point that also you make, Evelyn, in your chapter in the companion to public philosophy, that there's a sense in which public philosophy can has epistemic benefits to the academic philosopher, because it sort of, if nothing else, sort of keeps us in check, makes sure that the things we're talking about are actually, real world issues and so on. So I think that's a really nice point. Did you want to have any thoughts on that particular issue, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things going on here, actually. One is that historically and still today, philosophy has been and can be an extremely elite activity. I mean, if we think about like who counts as a philosopher, let's just say in the history of Europe, until basically yesterday, almost, for starters, you're only talking about people who are literate. So you've already eliminated whatever 90+% of the population. And then you're talking about a tiny, tiny group of people within that literate population. So, the people we consider to be philosophers, let's say in the entire 16th century in Germany, is like, I don't know, 50 guys or something. And they're all guys, right? This is an incredibly elite, it's the most elite of the elite activities, right? So on the one hand, we have that. And on the other hand, we have the idea that Evelyn mentioned at the very first sentence out of your mouth was everybody does philosophy. And I actually agree with that. So I think that philosophy is, on the one hand, like almost, it's just part of the human condition. But on the other hand, it's considered to be this highly specialized, refined thing where if you don't at least have a PhD, you're not even getting in the door, right? And so I think there's a little bit of I think this also goes to what you've been asking about with the power dynamics, like academic versus non-academic, because one way, so I think we're kind of circling around the fact that there's sort of two senses of the word philosophy here. Like, is it a specialized discipline, or is it just thinking deeply about life and all the things that life throws at you? And one idea that I think we're sort of flirting with is that the specialists who are in the elite, right, who used to be a socioeconomic elite and to some extent still are, but not as much, they would be kind of bringing their expertise to the people who are doing philosophy in the second sense, like just trying to figure out how to live, or do they know anything? Do they have free will, right? But at a kind of non-elite, non-technical way. And so then we would have something like this, like what you were saying, Lucia, about the philosopher's been out of the cave, right? And has gotten the PhD or whatever, and they're kind of coming back to everyone who has a set of philosophical concerns, but isn't a specialist elite philosopher. So, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that, but I think it's also, there's a lot of problematic assumptions behind that. So for one thing, at a given time and place, maybe being involved in elite philosophy will make you worse at philosophy, not better at philosophy, right? Because you might get, as Evelyn was saying, you might get railroaded into all of these bad ways of thinking. Like, do we now think that the scholastic philosophers in 13th century Paris were like really on to something? No, we think that they were systematically wrong about all kinds of things, right? I mean, even leaving religion aside, about physics, let's say, right? They weren't better off than the peasants as far as understanding the natural world, right? So I mean, I think this is a very complicated issue. And I think that it's kind of dangerous to assume that the elite philosophers sort of know what they're talking about and everyone else kind of doesn't know what they're talking about, but they'd quite like to understand what they're talking about a bit better, and that the job is for the elite philosopher to come help them do that. I don't think that's quite what's going on. even in history of philosophy, actually, because I mean, there you might think, well, of course you have to like read a whole bunch of stuff and go to the library, blah, blah, blah. But I get corrections and feedback and questions on my podcast all the time from non-academics. And it has shifted what I do and made me change the material that I produced for the book version, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, again, so that's why I said at the beginning that I think there's this kind of symbiotic, blurry relationship between the public facing part and the academic facing part. And I'm not trying to talk down academic philosophy, obviously, I'm an academic, but I still think that it's not as neat as just here come the experts to tell you what they know and then you'll think better. I think it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, just an example comes to mind of a particular, so this idea that, or this worry we might have that a particular subsection of society determining what kind of philosophical questions are interesting and worth pursuing. And one thing that comes to mind is Mary Midgley, who was a kind of very well-read, committed public philosopher, second half of the 20th century, had this radio transcript that was rejected by the BBC, and the point she was making, or one of the points she would have made had it come out on the BBC there is, if you take a look at the list of the great philosophers, pretty much all of them are bachelors. And she kind of says, like, if that weren't the case, then maybe worries about, if you ask somebody who's pregnant or who's got lots of kids, do other people exist? Do other minds exist? It's not a question that somebody in that situation is going to even conceive of, right? And so there's something there about like a point about who determines what kind of questions are philosophical. Okay, so going back to my list of questions, I mean, this was one of the ones I was hoping to get in early, but we've had so much to say already. I guess a question for all of you again, and maybe we can just go around alphabetically again. So maybe starting with Peter. Why do you, and maybe you feel like you've answered this already, but why do you guys engage in public philosophy? So, I mean, is it a professional commitment? Is it a personal commitment? Is it like a lawyer who does pro bono work on the side? What are your thoughts? Should everyone be doing public philosophy if they're a philosopher or not?
So again, maybe I'll start with the end, because I think the answer to that is definitely no. So for one thing, we don't need that much public philosophy, right? There's a lot of public philosophy out there to consume. And if every professional philosopher were doing public philosophy, I don't know who would make use of it all, right? And also I think it requires a certain set of skills and preferences maybe. So it's not for everybody. I certainly know a lot of philosophers who would not enjoy it and maybe would not be good at it, even though they're very good at other things. So I don't think it's like an essential part of what it is to be an academic philosopher to have this public side to what you're doing. And in fact, like going back to parenthetically, that's a worry I've always had about this impact stuff in the UK. Like, why are you implying that if there's no impact, then it's not worthwhile, right? I think that's just some dangerous assumptions behind that. But I mean, just speaking for myself, it has a lot to do with my twin brother. So my twin brother's in the art world. And when I started the podcast, he was working at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And he was like curating exhibits that were being seen by thousands and thousands of people. And I just thought, man, like he's found a way to take his academic training and do something with it that reaches all of these people. And I kind of know all the people who read my research personally, probably. I know all 24 of them. And I know how many students I have, and that's like, in the hundreds. And also it sort of weighed on me that being in England at the time, and now I'm in Germany, so it's still true, my paycheck is paid by the taxpayer, ultimately. So there were no tuition fees then in England, I should say. And so I just thought, like, don't I in some sense have a responsibility to make the best use of like this very fortunate situation I've happened to fall into, where I'm getting to do this thing that I love for a living. So I kind of started doing the podcast as a way of living with myself. So you could think of it as being, in a way, kind of selfish. Like I just wanted to stop feeling guilty about my life. That's basically why I started.
Evelyn, same question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this question. I'm also thinking about it in light of the last question. And I think one of the things that we like field philosophers certainly, but a lot of us, whether through the classes that we teach in the university or other kinds of public philosophy activities, what we could do, think of it as capacity building. And so it's not just that we have some content knowledge and that we share in the classroom, but that we're building critical thinking skills, but we're also building a kind of process where we encourage people to think about setting up systems of inquiry so that they're participatory and so that people have a chance to share their views without feeling like those are attacks, that we can create processes where there's genuine exchange of views, and where we see that the world is more complicated usually than we initially thought, and that the ethical obligations we owe each other are much more ambiguous maybe than we thought when we first walk into a situation. And so there was a comment in the chat earlier that reminded me that one of the things when we do field philosophy with professionals or with like community groups is that the goal really is to set up a kind of either institutional system, if it's with like a professional organization, or if it's just a community group that comes together regularly, then a norm for bringing people in and exchanging views and making that exchange of views constructive. So it's sort of like capacity building for democratic critical thinking. And that's just like in the background all the time.
Great, thank you. And Lucia.
Yes, no, I don't think everybody should do public philosophy either. I mean, even though they are part of the same family, public philosophy and research requires very different capacity, abilities, preference, and personal preference. I mean, one can be a really great researcher on a specific topic and not so good at making people, disseminate their research or making people thinking about or moderate a dialogue. So it requires very different capacity. That's why perhaps today we have this kind of distinction of professions, and probably that's one reason why we are discussing here today. It's a metaphilosophical question, because now we have people like me who do public philosophy as a job and others who do academic philosophy, and we ask, so are those the same profession or are different? They start within the same profession, I believe, within the same study, the same education, and then one specialize in one field or the other. I don't think that there is a moral duty in every academic philosophy that should engage in public philosophy, even though perhaps there could be an institutional attention to public philosophy, so that everyone who wants to do that can have the resources, the instrument, and obviously there is the issue of the evaluation, because if we want, and this is a urgent issue, I believe, if we want to do public philosophy seriously and not to, fall down in populism or, the bad version of public philosophy, we discussed it before, we need evaluation. And that is a great issue. How can we evaluate public philosophy? Which are our standards? And is the same to evaluate philosophy in living groups of people talking, then, writing a podcast or a blog article are the same or different? Which are our goals? I suggested one goal that was pedagogical and myetical, but perhaps because I'm focusing on live event, perhaps there are many others, like Evelyn said, is a different goal to bring people in community philosophy to address their issue in their community. How can we evaluate that kind of work? This, I believe, is our last question. I mean, as everybody, it is an issue we should in the future address in order to understand better what public philosophy is as well, and to avoid the dichotomy academic philosophy, public philosophy, but trying to combine the good part of both.
I mean, I think it's such an interesting question, kind of, can you and how might you quantify the impact? And it's one that, whether we like it or not, especially in, in the UK, for example, we have to think about this because we have the, the research excellent framework, which asks us to demonstrate impact. But you might think, well, the impact of philosophy, and particularly on demographics like children or elderly people or prisoners, it's not something quantifiable. It's just like, I guess, changing the way they think and getting them to think about certain things. And yeah, that question seems really hard to answer. Okay, well, thank you very much for putting up and responding to my questions. I'm gonna now, for the remainder of the session, so for the next 20-25 minutes, bring out some questions from attendees. So if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, just put it in the specific bit that says Q&A, because that's the one I'm checking, and we'll go from there. So the first question, kind of from the audience, it's an anonymous attendee, but the question is, what might the panelists say about the work of philosophers like Alain de Botton, for example? And I guess, like, the more general question there is something like, what's the relationship between public philosophy, something like pop psychology, books about how you should live your life, self-improvement? Because I think that there can be an overlap between these things, and, like, even on a very basic level, sometimes when you walk into a bookshop, philosophy and self-improvement are in the same shelf, for example. So I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that particular kind of question, and feel free to just jump in, whoever might have something to say.
Sounds like one for Lucia to me, because that sort of thing must come up a lot with the kind of people you work with now.
Well, no, I don't think they are the same. I mean, popular psychology, I'm not expert in popular psychology, so I'm quite embarrassed to answer that. I see them as very two different activity with two different goals. Psychology, perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to say something false here, perhaps dealing with how you feel and how you manage your emotion or your reaction to life, whereas philosophy is focusing on conceptual clarification. You mentioned Midgley before. I liked her idea as plumbing philosophy. Philosophy wants, or public philosophy wants, to make people aware of their conceptual needs, which is something perhaps very different from what a psychologist will do. I always explain we are not here to do therapy or to do that's a very different field. So but perhaps I'm not well aware enough on this other field, on this other discipline.
It's actually interesting because in antiquity, of course, philosophy was often thought of as having a therapeutic value, right? So in fact, there's a kind of pervasive thing that philosophers compared themselves to doctors, but they're doctors for the soul instead of doctors for the body. And there's things like the kind of popular Stoicism movement, which explains something that I didn't understand at first, which is that when I got to the Stoics, all the stats for my podcast went way up. Like, I got to Seneca and I was like, is this a mistake? Why did all these people download this episode about Seneca? And then I found out there's, like, people love Stoicism, right? So there's maybe something that's specific about what philosophy has become in our own day, which has made it go very far away from the kind of thing Alain de Botton wants to do. So, like, consolations of philosophy. Lots of philosophers wrote consolatory works in antiquity, Boethius, Seneca, etc. So that, I think, is a change in what the elite philosophers think philosophy is for. They used to think it was about therapy, and now they think it's about conceptual clarification, right? And of course, I think it's about all the things it's ever been about, because I'm a historian.
And there are people who are philosophical counselors, and there's a professional organization for them too, a certification. And so that's, I think, not so much about thinking about like typical therapy does, like, what is my condition, but more investigating what is the human condition, and then how do my experiences fit in with that, and how can that explain the experiences I'm having?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So here's the next question. This is from Ian. What is common between academic philosophy and philosophy as practiced by the public thinking philosophically, if that makes sense? And the next part of the question, how can academic philosophers encourage the public side? So I guess in a way the question is asking, like, is there something that we're doing every day as professionally employed philosophers that people who are in a more general sense interested in philosophy are doing, can do, should do?
You know, I think that maybe part of the reason I don't see such a big gulf between academic philosophy and like public philosophy is that I really think that good philosophy can almost always be explained in a way that any, you know, reasonably intelligent person can understand. So, I mean, if you're working on like, you know, some very technical stuff in modal logic, then you probably can't explain it in detail. But you could say, well, okay, well, like, you know, sometimes we say, if I'd stepped out into traffic, then I would have been hit by a car, I would have been killed. So these things that that could have happened but didn't. So that's what I'm interested in. And I'm trying to show that we can understand sentences like that by thinking about them in the following way, right? So you can, like, at least in a general way, you can convey what any philosophical discussion is about within academic philosophy. You maybe can't, like, you know, go through all 30 pages of what you would say about it. But I don't think that there's like a difference in kind between, or a difference in topic necessarily between, like, for example, like just anecdotally, so I've been going through all this stuff from my History of Philosophy podcast. I never got to something where I thought, oh, I just can't explain that. That's too hard. And so in fact, I guess I would never even think of having that reaction to this. The question is always, how am I going to explain this? The question is never, can I explain this? And I think that I would feel the same way if I were doing a podcast trying to present contemporary philosophy. So I would just present it in a way that doesn't require like lots of vocabulary or technical apparatus. And it might be whatever, like less rigorous, less detailed or something, but I don't think that the philosophical point would necessarily get lost or have to be lost. Or at least I'd like to be shown, and I'd need to be shown that that has to happen.
Yeah, just I guess related to that, I read a really nice another blog post. This was by Barry Lamb, who runs another philosophy podcast, Hi-Fi Nation, which is philosophy in narrative form, and he has you know, the blog post is itself a really nice example. So he says, you know, he begins the blog post with a story about a friend of his, and then he says, and now here's how I could have started this if I were writing an academic philosophy paper. And I guess the point he's making is the ideas are the same, the problem is the same, but it's the form in which it's presented is very different and tailored towards a particular audience. You know, an audience of academic philosophers, which, as you said earlier, Peter, isn't often very large, but they're on board with the kind of problem, with the kind of idea that this is a problem worth thinking about. But with a different kind of audience, you know, the challenge is to generate interest in the first place. Okay. Here's a really nice question, or I thought it was a good question. So could the panelists speak about the challenges / opportunities for public philosophy in their particular countries? So I guess it's a nice question because you're all in different countries. So as an American, this is from A.K. Anderson. As an American, I'm trying to think of a public philosopher with wide sway or purchase. Martha Nussbaum or Cornel West, though he teaches religion, for example, might be candidates. And the question writer asks or says at the end, offhand, it seems easier to be a well-known public philosopher in Europe. I don't know if you guys would agree that that's true, but yeah, any particular challenges or opportunities in terms of doing public philosophy where you're doing it? Maybe Lucia, you're in Italy, so is there anything?
well, yes, I'm in Italy, so in Italy there are a few opportunities, not so many, but the University of Bologna started this project where people trained by the university are now providing philosophy, with children, with citizens in general terms. There is also University of Padua. But I think the movement of philosophy for children and now philosophy for community is well spread around the world. I mean, it started in the US and now the UK has this Sapere Association, no? There are a lot is going on in the English-speaking world about public philosophy, philosophy through nature, or in France, the Café Philo, who started in the 19th and then spread all around France. This was an experience where people, meet in the cafe and they discuss it together. So I agree with Peter before he said, I don't think that the difference is a kind of banalization of language, or, you choose certain topic instead of others. But still, at least me, is one thing when I want to explain to people Hegel's theory of mind, which was my specialization. No? So my PhD was on Hegel theory of mind. And so there I'm trying simple way to clarify one author theory. Whereas of course, this is not my goal when I engage with children or prisoners who couldn't care less about Hegel, or, So there, perhaps I'm starting with question, what do you think about languages? So what do you think about, and then in this sense, the activity is a bit different, I believe. It's not paternalistic again. I'm engaged too with them in trying to clarify words they use, concept, and trying to let emerge implicit assumptions that perhaps they have, but they don't know they have. And the only difference between me and them is that I'm a bit more used to detect those assumptions or those bias going on. Only that is my profession coming to make a difference, but it's not that my opinion obviously is better than theirs. Yeah, so sorry, I just united two questions, but this was the relation was because I was talking about philosophy for children or philosophy for community who engage with public in this dialogical way. So I guess they understand public philosophy as this dialogical activity more than disseminating academic results.
Thanks a lot, Lucia. Evelyn, any particular challenges, opportunities, I guess, in the US?
So speaking for people who work in universities and want to do public philosophy, I think the bottleneck probably comes from our colleagues in philosophy departments. I find that the world has an insatiable appetite for public philosophy and lots of different forms of it. And I feel like I have not yet seen anyone who has run out, come to the end of their list and can't get a bite. There's so many different ways of engaging. And universities tend to be pretty supportive too, whether it's elite universities, community colleges, places in between. There may be a shortage of resources and a shortage of time, but at the university level, there's usually support for whether it's doing things that are interdisciplinary, doing things that combine research and pedagogy, so that you're taking your students, giving students experiential learning experiences, just a lot of different creative things that are happening. The bottleneck is when we come to being judged by our peers who want to see that we're doing things exactly by the book. And then it becomes like an add-on, because public philosophy does take a lot of energy. If you have to do everything that you otherwise would and then add in public philosophy, it's just too much. But I think one of the responses there is that, it opens up a creative space for people to do what they value. But I don't think it risks being seen as something that everyone should do. And that's just not the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. Peter, you're in Germany, but you've been in the UK previously, and any other thoughts on, I mean, I guess on what the state of public philosophy in Germany? I don't know personally.
Yeah, I mean, so I've lived in 3 countries, right? So I lived for the first 28 years of my life in the States, then for 12 years in the UK, and since 2012 I've been here in Germany. I think of those 3 countries, public philosophy is in the best shape in the UK, partially because there are a lot of platforms for doing it that are kind of there because of things like the BBC. So you have shows like In Our Time, right, where philosophers don't even need to do anything. They just have to like pick up the phone because there's a producer from In Our Time calling, and then they get to talk to whatever it is, 30 million people, right? So that's pretty cool. Things in Germany are different. So there are shows on philosophy on the radio and on TV, maybe not quite as prominent. But in addition, like the tradition of the public intellectual is more alive and well here. So like Jürgen Habermas, who lives not so far away from me, is one of the most famous philosophers in the world. And he's in the newspaper and stuff still a lot. Partially because of the kind of philosopher he is, right? So he's very interested in like public discourse anyway. I think the other thing to bear in mind here is that there's a fundamental difference between academia in the States and here, with the UK having followed the lead of the States and moved away from the more German model, because in the States, philosophy is mostly done in, I mean, university philosophy is done in a kind of capitalist setting where the students are paying for something. So there might be a kind of worry about like, why are you giving away this stuff for free that we're charging kids $30,000 a year for, however much it is now? It's probably more than that, a lot of these universities. Whereas in Germany, there's no tuition fees. And the chat is going to fill now with people who want to come study in Germany, right? And in fact, they're considered to be like public resources in a way. So in a sense, every time you show up to give a lecture at a German university, you're doing public philosophy. And so every academic is involved in that. And I suppose the same is true in Italy, right, Lucia? So I think that actually changes the playing field quite a lot, because German academics may not feel like, if they were asked, why aren't you doing public philosophy? They were like, what do you mean? I'm a civil servant. I teach at a university. Of course I do public philosophy. That's what we're doing here. So the whole thing is public in a sense. And so I think that changes the whole calculation quite a lot.
Thanks. That's interesting. So there are some differences in opportunity and challenge across different places. There's 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and see if we can get 2 questions in. So this is from Graham Tiffany. So the question reads: at the end of the day, field philosophers go home to the academy, right? So my question is, what does it take for communities to develop philosophical capacity or capacities within them? And maybe even, is it possible for a community to develop such a capacity?
I will say that's exactly the question I was trying to answer earlier, by saying that when we do, but even in the classroom, that I think we should always be mindful, and I think most of us are, of creating some routines and structures that people take away with them. It's not just content knowledge, it's exactly this. And I'll say a little more. So when I work with, scientists, or when we work with technologists or other groups, the goal is to do some institution building so that we're setting up practices and expectations, and sometimes they're written down in codes that require things like getting stakeholder input on decision making and having representatives on decision making bodies. So it's not just like modeling the tools of inclusivity and epistemic humility and open-mindedness, but also seeing those actually be put into the rules that then guide society.
That's great. Thanks, Evelyn. I mean, just for what it's worth, I mean, one of my favorite kind of, I guess, slightly more historical public philosophers is Susan Stebbing, who I really see as someone working in that, she's thinking to some purpose is described as a manual for clear thinking, right? It's a how-to guide. Lucia, this idea of what it takes to develop philosophical capacities. I mean, I guess that's kind of the aim of your work with various demographics in society, right?
Yes, I would say patience. I mean, you need a lot of time. You need a lot. It's not something that, you know, you start today and after 1 week you have this philosophical group full of philosophical questions. No, you need a lot of patience, a lot of work. And for instance, well, this experience I just finished in prisons, the first month were devoted to create a community at all, because people were not used to talk, to talk properly. So I spent weeks in training them to dialogue, to manage disagreement and to not take personally the disagreement. So it took really a long run. And only after that, after I won their trust and they trusted each other, then we were able to be constructive. So it takes a lot of work because before was also already said, at university you have an elite as public who is willing to be there and who has a precise history and education. So is not representative of the great variety of humanity, and public philosophy somehow push you into this great variety, and you have to win them. So it really takes a lot of endeavors and never give up. I mean, perhaps today has not worked well enough, but tomorrow it will. And in my experience, people got surprised how funny it is, how stimulating it is, how engaging it is. So the rewards are there. I mean, it's not only hard work, it's also rewarding.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that I guess philosophers take for granted that it's okay to disagree, but that's
yes.
in another setting, that's a big deal.
Exactly, yeah. The point for not everybody, it's okay to disagree. I mean, a lot of people take it personally, and you know, everyone has his own ego. But we as philosophers are used to disagreement, and whereas usually people are not. And you know, polarization is behind the edge, and the self-defense is behind the edge. So you have to avoid all this kind of phenomenon.
Peter, do you have any thoughts on establishing philosophical communities?
Well, I mean, I think we only have 1 minute left. I just like sort of echo something Lucia just said, which is, I think something we shouldn't overlook here is that philosophy is just kind of awesome, right? So, I mean, it's so interesting in so many different ways. There's so many different issues that come up in philosophy. And it's really not like, I mean, with all due respect to chemists, it's not like chemistry. So, I mean, perfectly reasonable people could fail to be interested in chemistry, I think. I mean, I think chemistry is really interesting, but I can sort of imagine not being interested in chemistry, but I can't really imagine not being interested in philosophy at any level, right? You just have to find a way of engaging. So I think to some extent, public philosophy is kind of like it's kind of an easy target in the sense that if you just present philosophy to people, they'll go for it. So yeah, that's maybe like a rousing thoughts to encourage us all about the whole project.
That's great. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna abuse my power and ask one question, but I think it's a question that probably has a short answer, so I don't think we'll take too long. So there was a question that said, are you inspired by any historical, or maybe not historical, philosopher who you would consider a public philosopher? And I'm going to open that question up a little bit more and say, like, you know, for the audience here who are now, because philosophy is awesome, want to do more public philosophy, is there a piece of literature or a piece of media you would direct them towards, or a figure? You know, so I've kind of mentioned Stebbing and Midgley, so those are my answers, but what about you guys?
Maybe people.
Before we go, I would love it if people in the audience would put their suggestions in the chat. That would just be great to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion in the chat has really, there's been a lot going on in there, and there's loads of links that have been put in there. So I think that even before we give any answers to that question, there's more for people to engage with. But yeah, Peter.
Maybe philosophers who write fiction, like Iris Murdoch,
be
a good example. I think that there's sort of a tendency to assume that philosophy only comes in the form of treatises or something, right? Or academic publications more recently. But a lot of philosophy is literature, Plato, for example. So, and I think that hasn't stopped being the case. So I think, if you're reading certain kinds of novels, then you're already reading philosophy, although you might not know it. You probably do know it if you're reading Iris Murdoch, but.
That's a great suggestion. Lucia?
Yes, perhaps just an addition is not an alternative, but I was obviously recalled to the ancient Greek idea of philosophy, obviously Socrates, or, but it's different from that example because it's a dialogue, is a living experience, is not something we can fix on paper. So that would be an example of public philosophy as living event, at least.
Brilliant. Evelyn, anything you want to add?
I think I take my inspiration from John Dewey. Somebody commented on that earlier, but it's not a very good writer, so I'm not gonna say, oh, go read The Public and Its Problems. And since I spend so much time teaching philosophy and writing philosophy, most of the time when I'm not doing philosophy, I just want to get outdoors and not think about philosophy. But I make an exception for Barry Lamb's podcast, for Hi-Fi Nation, that it is, like you said, it's presented in a way that's much sort of storytelling. And I can't imagine not enjoying that.